Market inefficiencies, price floors, and subsidies. So we're going to discuss the price floor. A price floor is a government regulation that sets a minimum price that must be paid for a product, good, or service. Sometimes governments intervene to push market prices up instead of down. But just like price ceilings, price floors are intended to help some people, but generate predictable and undesirable side effects. Price floors are used in many markets, and typically we see price floors in agriculture and most noticeably the minimum wage law. A minimum wage is a price floor that tells businesses that they must pay a minimum amount per hour. So how a price floor causes inefficiency? As we discussed before, a price floor creates missed opportunities, and it creates problems within the market similar to those of a price ceiling. Price floors are going to create a surplus, that is to say, too much product being produced. They're going to reduce consumer and producer surplus. They will create a deadweight loss from inefficiently low quantity of product being produced, and they create a black market. So perhaps you may not be familiar with price floors, but price floors are very much used in agriculture. Price floors in school lunches. If you or someone you know has ever eaten in a school cafeteria, you have probably been the beneficiary of a price floor on certain products that the agricultural industry produces. So price floors started very early on during the 1930s when the U.S. economy was going through a Great Depression. Prices were really low and farmers couldn't cover their costs and they were suffering. So to aid farmers, the U.S. government imposed price floors on agricultural products like beef and sugar and pork. And basically what that meant was that the public had to pay a higher price. In other words, the floor did not allow farmers to sell their products below a certain price. Price floors are meant to create a surplus. Government will reduce the supply of the product by paying farmers not to grow crops. And the crops that are produced are bought by the government, and the government takes that excess surplus off the market. This food is then given away to schools as free or cheap lunches. Today, during the pandemic, government is also supplying or subsidizing farmers and buying products from farmers and using those in food banks. So let's just take a quick look at what this would look like. We're going to look at the market for butter in the absence of government controls. So here we have the demand curve and we have the supply curve. And we see the equilibrium price is $1 and the quantity demanded of butter is 10 million pounds. The quantity supplied is 10 million pounds. And we have our equilibrium point. So this is the free market. Now, when the government introduces a price support, meaning that the prices cannot fall below $1.20, you can see that this is going to create a surplus. The quantity of butter demanded at $1.20 is going to be significantly less. It's going to be 9 million pounds. As opposed to the equilibrium quantity of 10 million pounds. The quantity of butter supplied at $1.20 price floor is going to be 12 million pounds of butter. So what to do with this excess? Okay, so in this case, we have 3 million pounds of butter that are surplus or too much that are being sold at $1.20. So that is valued at $1.20 times 3 million pounds, $3.6 million worth of butter. So when the government introduces a price support, it very often buys up the surplus amount at the supported price. Now, this is designed to help farmers, especially during periods when there's severe drought, when there are trade issues that might affect farmers. But it's also important to note that this is taxpayer money as well. So here's what my thought was, what else does the federal government subsidize? Do I agree with these subsidies? And do I think that this is the best use of my tax dollar? So your assignment is to read this article called Government Subsidies, Farm, Oil, Export Industries, etc. And it's called What Are the Major Federal Government Subsidies? And here is the link. Okay, so I would like for you to please read this article because I think that you will find it very interesting. Then, after you read the article, return to the rest of this presentation. We're going to move on to the discussion of another price floor, which is a minimum wage. The minimum wage is a price floor basically telling employers that they have to pay a minimum amount of money to their workers. They cannot pay less. So as you look around this different map, the map of the United States, the federal minimum wage law is $7.25, but each state can implement a higher wage rate. So here we are in Texas, and our minimum wage is $7.25. Hi, we're going to talk about market inefficiencies created by price floors. A price floor is a government regulation that sets a minimum price that must be paid for a product or a good or service. So you want to write this down in your notes. A price floor is a government regulation that sets a minimum price that must be paid for a product, good, or service. And price floors are used in many markets. Normally we see them in agricultural markets, and we see them in minimum wage laws. So minimum wage law is a price floor, basically telling employers that they cannot pay below a certain amount. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the impacts of a minimum wage law on market efficiency. So in the US, the minimum wage is $7.25. Different states have different wages, minimum wages. So for example, California has a $12 minimum wage. But we're going to look at the case of El Paso. As you know, our minimum wage is $7.25. For a floor to be effective, it has to be above the equilibrium. I would argue that in El Paso, our wage rate lies somewhere between $8 and $10. So I'm going to say for our discussion that our equilibrium wage rate in El Paso is $9. Okay, so I've drawn our demand and supply curve here with the intersection at $9. So one question that we might ask is, with the equilibrium wage rate is $9, how many people will be employed? Okay, so of course the number of people employed is 4,000 people. Okay, what is consumer surplus and producer surplus? So again, this will be a calculation that we've already done again. So we calculate it going 1/2 base times height. And so just to refresh your memory, let's look at consumer surplus. Remember that is the area above the market price and below the demand curve. So the base is going to go from 0 to 4,000. And the height is from 16 minus 9. 16 minus 9 is 7. And we're going to divide all that by 2. We work this out, and this is 4,000 times 7,000 is 28,000 divided by 2 gives us consumer surplus of $14,000. Okay. So I'm just going to jot that down here so that we can use that for future reference. Okay, now then let's look at how much producer surplus is. So again, we're going to use the same formula, 1/2 base times height. Recall that the producer surplus is going to be the area below the equilibrium price and above the supply curve. And so we're going to figure out how much all this consumer surplus is. So again, 1/2 base times height, the base is 4,000. And the height is going to be from the $9, the market price, to the intercept, which is 250, so 9 minus 250. Okay, so it's going to be 4,000 times, that's going to come out to $6.50. And we're going to take all this, divide it by 2, and that's going to give us 13,000. Okay, $13,000 of consumer surplus with a wage rate of $9. In this case, you can see that both consumer and surplus are maximized, yet unlike other problems, they're not equal to each other. Okay, so now we know the value of consumer surplus and producer surplus at our equilibrium wage rate. Now, let's take a look at, well, what is the impact of an $8 an hour minimum wage? Well, if we had a minimum wage of $8, you could see that that would be below the equilibrium. That would be less than the equilibrium. So a minimum wage that's below equilibrium doesn't have an impact. Let's say that there was enough pressure politically to impose a minimum wage, which is typically why a minimum wage is imposed, because there's political pressure. The desire is to help people have higher living standards by earning higher wages. But let's say in this case we have a $12 minimum wage. What is going to be the impact? Well, let's go ahead and draw that $12 minimum wage. Okay, that's the price floor, the minimum wage. At $12, 2,500 people are employed. The demand for labor, these are the businesses hiring labor, they're only going to demand 2,500 workers when the price is $12. The supply of labor, okay, this is you and me, we go into the market and we're supplying our labor into the market. At a price of $12, the supply is going to increase because that's a higher wage. Okay? So the quantity supplied of labor is going to be, according to this diagram, maybe you can zoom in on that, 5,500. And the quantity demanded, businesses are only going to demand 2,500. So this is going to create a surplus of 3,000 workers. That means there's going to be 3,000 workers who are out there looking for work and they're not going to be able to find work. So that becomes a surplus, and that means that a minimum wage at this level is going to create unemployment. Okay, so there's some verbiage that you need to be aware of. The term surplus, which we've used before, means too much. Okay, so in this case, because of this price floor, this minimum wage, we have more workers willing to work at $12 than we have jobs. So we have a surplus, meaning too much. Okay, so that's one term you need to be aware of. Too much. Write this down in your notes. Then we have another term that is confusing, which was consumer surplus. Remember that that is the extra value that a consumer gets when you calculate the difference between what the consumer is willing to pay and the market price. That's consumer surplus. Then we have producer surplus, which is the value that producers get when the minimum amount that they're willing to sell the product is less than the equilibrium price, and this becomes consumer surplus. We also have total surplus when we add these up. So don't get those confused. There's surplus, meaning too much, There is consumer surplus, meaning extra value received by the consumer because they don't have to pay what they're willing to pay. They get to pay the equilibrium price. And there is producer's surplus, which is the value that the producers get when they get to sell their product at a higher price than their cost. Okay, so I just want to make sure you all have those three terms clear in your head because it can be a little bit confusing sometimes. So we see the impact of a $12 minimum wage creating unemployment in the market. The $12 minimum wage also creates a reduction in consumer surplus and in producer surplus because at this price, consumer surplus has now been reduced from this giant triangle right here to this smaller triangle. So we have a reduction in consumer surplus. Remember that the consumer here is the business hiring labor. So they're not going to be able to hire as many people as they would like to hire due to cost concerns from a business perspective. Then from a producer surplus, we also have a reduction in producer surplus because only 2,500 workers are going to find work. Okay. Now, minimum wage also creates a deadweight loss. The deadweight loss is this triangle. And this deadweight loss represents wasted resources as people look for jobs that don't exist, and also wasted resources because there are businesses out there who could put these people to work, but they can't do it at a lower wage rate. So again, we find the amount of deadweight loss the same way we did before. Okay, 1/2 base times height. The base being 4,000 minus 2,500 times the height of 12 minus 6. Okay, so that's 1,500 times 6. Oh, that's so messy. Sorry. Let me clean it up a little bit. Okay, so 7,000, 10,500 divided by 2. Deadweight loss is $5,250 worth of value lost in the market when we have a minimum wage put into place. So definitely that is a loss to society, all of this. Now, the other concern with a minimum floor is that it does create a black market. It is illegal to pay people below this $12 wage rate, but employers can get around it through several tactics. They may hire people who are not eligible to work in the United States and pay them lower wage rates, and these individuals would be reluctant to go to authorities and complain about wage rates for fear for their own personal job security. The other thing that employers can do is pay a base fee plus tips and commission, and then that would be a way to get around the minimum wage, especially if people don't earn enough to cover that minimum wage. And then finally, employers can pay by the unit or by what's called a piecemeal rate. And sometimes that piecemeal rate is so low that it would be impossible for a worker to get to that minimum wage rate. So in this way, market inefficiencies are created by price floors. I have assigned a video to you about garment workers in California. California has a minimum wage rate of $12 an hour, and this video discusses the market conditions and labor conditions. So I want you to watch it. I want you to think about how that video will fall into the construct of what we've been talking about, and also look at it in terms of, are there negative consequences of these behaviors? Are all the costs to the firm being absorbed by the workers, or is the firm absorbing the costs? So make sure you watch this. It does tie into our next discussion about market externalities. Externalities are extra benefits or extra costs associated with certain activities that our demand and supply curve may or may not capture. After you watch this video, I want you to take note of 3 caveats, or 3 things that you need to understand. So the first thing is that although a market may be efficient, it is not necessarily fair. In fact, fairness or equity often conflict with efficiency. So because society cares about equity, government intervention in a market that reduces efficiency while increasing equity can be justified. So what this means is that even though sometimes the markets are not fair, rather, even though the markets are efficient, that is to say marginal benefit equals marginal cost, they are not always fair. And because fairness and equity is something that we are concerned with as a society, sometimes governments intervene in order to increase the amount of fairness. The second thing to remember is that markets sometimes fail. Even under very good conditions, markets can fail to deliver the right quantity of a good or service. And when this occurs, markets no longer maximize total surplus. We could argue that the markets have failed to provide us with adequate amounts of protective equipment, personal protection equipment, adequate amounts of facial masks, adequate amounts of health care, adequate amounts of cleaning supplies. And in some of these instances, it might be necessary for the government to intervene in some form to try to correct this. And third, even if the market equilibrium maximizes total surplus, this does not mean that it results in the best outcome for every individual and every producer. So those are important things to remember. Now, these observations are made by Paul Krugman, and Paul Krugman is an economist who specifically talks about market efficiencies. So even though we talk about the merits of having an efficient market and marginal benefit equaling marginal cost, the free market can create outcomes that are not beneficial to all people. So, for instance, a price floor that kept the price up would benefit sellers in some instances. But in the market equilibrium, there's no way to make some people better off without making others worse off. And that's the definition of efficiency. So you want to keep those ideas in mind as we go through this discussion.